This week we'll be looking at chapters 6 and 7. It begins a deeper look at mining and what happened after the initial gold rush. There are 5 things that happened between the years 1867 and 1872 that really impacted mining in Colorado. The first thing you see on the list here is the Paris Exposition. What happened is that some people from Colorado took some ore samples over to Paris, and what they did is they sold themselves. They got a lot of investors from that international fair, and it allowed them to become a state that was well known for mining. So with the Paris Exposition, that was kind of the beginning of Colorado's world renown as a mining state. The next thing you see on your list are pamphlets. The second thing they did was to develop pamphlets for immigrants. They distributed them at all immigration agencies in the United States, so if people are coming into any of the immigration agencies in the United States on the East Coast, they would see a pamphlet that detailed Colorado and life as a miner and a job as a miner. So that brought a lot of people into Colorado seeking jobs as miners. The next thing that you see on your list here is railroads. We see between these years the development and connections between places like Cheyenne and Denver. This connection allows people to come into Colorado to work in a way that was much, much easier than those wagon trains coming into Colorado, and much safer for a lot of them during that time. So railroads is the next thing on your list there. Next we have smelting. In Colorado, the mining industry looked a lot different than it did in California, as we mentioned before. Whereas in California, what happened is people were able to go into rivers and basically pan for gold. Here, our gold and silver and our minerals are locked into rocks, basically, which makes it extremely hard to extract. For many years, people found it impossible to extract the gold and silver, but then they developed a process called smelting, which allowed them to extract the gold and silver. So this is a process that got started as well during this time period. The last thing on the list here is the Ballston-Allison Act. It was passed in 1878. What it was an act by the federal government that made them buy between $2 to $4 million worth of silver. And that was a really, really huge thing for Colorado because a lot of our early mines were silver mines. And that's going to be one of the first mines that we talk about here. As we delve into Colorado mining history, what you're going to see here are 2 parallel stories that I really want you to focus on and think about. The first story is called The Rise of Mining Town, and the second one is The Loss of a Way of Life. The Rise of a Mining Town basically details the story of people who came to mining towns to work, what that looked like, and what their living and working conditions were like. So within a town, and we're going to talk about the town of Leadville as an example of a mining town, we see the rise of Leadville in 1877. You can see that's the year right before that Ballston-Allison Act, and that had a huge impact on Leadville, which was not only a silver mining town, but became eventually, once they found gold in the town, a gold mining town. So who lives in a place like Leadville? Or a place like any sort of mining town? Well, you can see there's a wide range of people, everyone from poor to working class, businessmen, women, artists, both con artists and real artists. Within that town, then, you see kind of a stratosphere of different people. And those different people bring different things to the community. So we have the immigrant communities, people coming from different ethnic backgrounds, people coming from the East Coast who maybe didn't find enough opportunity, or maybe they're just moving into the United States for the first time. They bring themselves over into Colorado as a way to find new jobs, as a way to start a new life, and possibly find opportunity. We also have African American communities. If you think about the timeline in U.S. history, the Civil War ends in 1865. African Americans get their freedom, and they are looking for opportunities as well. So we see a lot of African American people coming into gold mines, silver mines, as a way to make some money and eventually buy some land. We also have another group of people who move into mining towns, and these are people I would classify as businessmen. People like James Brown, Charles Beecher, Horace Tabor. These names should ring a bell. You see a lot of different places in Denver today named after them. The Tabor Center in Denver, the Beecher Center in Denver, and James Brown is most infamous for having married Molly Brown. So all of these gentlemen started in mining towns, but their start was a little bit different. They brought money with them. So a lot of these gentlemen, like Horace Tabor, for example, made his money in hardware. He actually started a lot of hardware stores. The last one that he started before moving to Leadville was in Boulder. He did very, very well for himself, decided once he was established in Boulder that he was going to move up to Leadville. He happened to be one of the first hardware stores to get started in Leadville, and he made a whole lot of money up in Leadville and became an investor in one of the mines after he furnished some early miners with some of their goods. So he made a whole lot of money in Leadville. So these gentlemen are different than immigrants in that they are people who benefit from starting a business in the mines. You also see people like Oscar Wilde. Oscar Wilde comes through Leadville for a short period of time. He is one of many famous people who venture into Leadville. Oscar Wilde is a writer, a playwright, most widely known for perhaps those things, but also for just being a bit eccentric. So I would welcome you to look him up and learn a little bit more about him so that you can kind of see the wide range of people who came in and out of Leadville, or mining towns in general in Colorado. Doc Holliday also visited Leadville for a short period of time. He is a gambling man. Originally, he was a dentist, but he is better known as a gambler and a gunfighter. So you might see or remember him from movies like Tombstone, and I do have a clip for you to watch of Tombstone if you are at all interested. It kind of gives you a flavor for what life may have been like for people like Doc Holliday in a mining town. When we think about mining towns, we also want to think about living conditions. Of course, living conditions varied to a certain degree depending on what your ability to live was. So if you were a poor working class, you might have lived in a shack. If you were lucky enough to be a hardware store owner, you probably lived in some building that was much more well equipped than the shack that miners lived in. But when we also think about living conditions, we want to think about poor sanitation. Most of these mining communities were thrown up very quickly, and because of that, they weren't able to construct places to go to the bathroom, to take baths, things like that. And what that resulted in was a whole lot of disease. You have diseases that are basically born from poor sanitation conditions like cholera, typhoid. Cholera is a disease in which you contract it from drinking water that has not been properly filtered, and it results in some heavy diarrhea, vomiting, and eventually death if it's not taken care of. Typhoid is the same thing, contracted from water or from touching something that has not been sanitized. And what that results in is a high fever and eventually death if it's not taken care of with antibiotics. Food was also a large issue in mining towns. If anybody has been up in the high country, you know that gardens are possible, but they're not very easy to tend to. So most of the time what they would live off are meat that they could hunt. They might get lucky and be able to buy from a grocery store, but food was not readily available, and certainly caused a lot of the problem as well. Working conditions is another thing I want you to think about. It certainly depended upon what your profession was, and that would help dictate then what your working conditions were. So working conditions for a miner would be vastly different than the working conditions for somebody who owned a store, or for somebody who was perhaps the mayor of the town. So we'll talk a little bit more about working conditions next time. But here I just want you to think about what that would look like. So for example, for miners, they would have had a day in which they would have gone into a mine. They would have probably worked a 12-hour day. They would be exposed to toxic gases, high temperatures, and then they would also have to be thinking about explosives and things like that they had to put into the mines in order to extract the minerals. I also put down here tombstone because that is yet another example of working conditions. You can see in the clip that these gentlemen are very well dressed, and their working conditions were probably vastly different than a miner's. So this kind of just gives you an example of how different working conditions were depending upon what role you played in a mine. The last thing I want you to think about for mines are that early mining towns were basically created from an environment that was dictated by the state. The state put in place many laws that were very business friendly. Some examples of things that they did is that they created a 10-year tax exemption for mines. What that means basically is that people who mine didn't have to pay taxes. They also were very lenient with corporate laws. You wouldn't have to incorporate. You could hold as many shares of a company as you wanted to. Those things don't exist today for good reason. Colorado also thought that child labor laws weren't a good idea if they wanted to encourage miners to come to Colorado and people to invest in mines. So they would allow people to have their children work in the mines. There were no child labor laws at this time. In addition, there was no railroad regulation. So all of these things combined basically allowed people to come in, do very well in mines, and encouraged people to invest in mines. The last piece here is you have the development of a lot of universities during this time period. So not only are they supporting them through business, but they are educating people to go into these industries. So you have universities like the Colorado School of Mines, which was traditionally a mining school. You have things like CSU develop, which was an agricultural school during this time period. In 1890, the Sherman Silver Purchase Act was passed. This was a renewal of the federal government's desire to support silver, and they basically agreed to continue to purchase silver. However, in 1893, this act was repealed, so the federal government no longer was willing to purchase silver, and what this did is it caused a Great Depression in Colorado because a lot of our mines were producing silver at this time. People moved down to Denver because they didn't have jobs, and the price of silver went way, way down. The last thing that I want you to look at for this week is the loss of a way of life. So while we have the great rise of our mining industry in Colorado, and this creates basically the state that we see today, we also see that it causes the Ute people to lose their way of life. So this week I also want you to watch the video that I have posted under this week about the Ute, and I want you to fill out the dates for what happens between about the same time period that I detailed above for the miners. So you can see the dates here are 1868, 1873, 1878, 1879, and then the final couple dates here on your list are 1882, and then 1905. The last date I want to explain briefly to you, that was a period of allotment in which people basically were able to come onto the reservation and buy reservation land. And that's it for this week.